Welcome to What's Next from AgResearch, a podcast exploring science answers to big questions. I'm Erin. I work at AgResearch, but I'm not a scientist. I do have a lot of questions about our science, though, and I thought that you might too. In this episode, I'm asking if there's room for livestock farming in the future, or are we going to have to massively change what we do with our land? New Zealand exports over 90% of our red meat to over 110 markets around the world, and red meat's our second largest export. We also export over 95% of our milk products produced to more than 130 different countries worldwide. Our main customers are both other countries and large international corporates, and they're demanding higher standards for areas like environmental standards and animal welfare. And that means we need to make sure the New Zealand food story lines up with reality. And if it doesn't, we need to work out how to change it so that it does. And when I say our food story, that's that idyllic image of clean, green, rolling hills, bathed in sunshine with happy, healthy animals, usually gamboling about outside. Is that still a possibility in the future, say 50 years from now? At the same time, environmental and animal rights groups around the world sometimes seem to have our primary sector in their sights, with multiple campaigns aiming to damage one of our country's key sources of income. So who's right here? And what does the farm of the future look like, and how do we get there? Luckily, there's a collection of scientists looking at exactly these questions at AgResearch, aiming to work out the balance for sustainable, resilient and regenerative pastoral agriculture. To get us started, I thought we'd talk with Senior Scientist Robyn Dynes. Farming is Robyn's passion. She's an expert in farm systems and has been thinking quite a bit about how we farm and the future of farming landscapes in New Zealand. For some context, Robyn, you grew up on a farm, sort of shoulder to shoulder with Dad. Can you tell me what farming was like with him?
Yes, Erin, I very much was brought up by my dad. He was the classic, everything could be fixed with number 8 wire or binder twine. So when I expressed a strong interest in learning to plough, he said, well, I'm off to town, the tractor and the plougher down the paddock, off you go. Yeah, I'm not an expert plougher, but ploughing is one of those techniques that we don't use so much now, Erin, anyway. So yes, he believed girls could do anything.
Well, I think that you're showing that they can, which is great. So if we think about farming and how it's changed over the last few decades, there's a lot that's different now. You know, we've got fewer sheep, more dairy, no subsidies, more regulation. So I thought we could have a quick look backwards before we look forwards. How's farming changed?
Look, farming, in fact, I think changes constantly. I love it when farmers say, we farm just like we used to. Ask them a couple of questions and they go, oh, no, we don't really. But look, there has been some phases in farming, definitely. So post the Second World War through till the mid-1980s, successive New Zealand governments were actively encouraging growth in our exports from farming. This was very much the era where New Zealand grew on the back of the sheep, so our wool exports followed by our meat exports. The government was providing significant incentives from free farm advisors, subsidised incentives for the subsidy of lime, superphosphate. There were ballot farms, so there was a broad range of support for farming. The mid-1980s, the farming world changed pretty much overnight. So we moved from the strongly supported sector to a free market economy. The farming response to that was productivity growth. There were farmers who had to both survive and thrive, and we must remember many didn't survive that. Those that thrived delivered extraordinary gains in productivity in a very short period of time. Just look at the increase in carcass weight of lambs and the number of lambs weaned. Phenomenal improvement. Part of that thriving was the start to see significant land use change, some on the back of disaster. So we saw the East Coast go into pine trees. Everyone agreed that was the right response to Cyclone Bowler at a time when returns from farming were low. Then we saw right through the 1990s that rapid expansion in dairy farming for a variety of reasons. The opportunity was there. Farmers saw it, and we saw that change. Somewhere from the late 1990s, the impacts of intensification were becoming well understood. And so we saw our regional councils start to focus on water quality, start asking the questions, and we've now, through the mid-2000s to now, we're in some balance. where society is asking for a balance on the environmental cost of farming, while our farmers are still seeking productivity and profitability, but within that balanced landscape.
So farming has always been changing and it's going to continue to go that way, isn't it? So if we fast forward, say, 50 years into the future, what do you think farming in New Zealand could look like?
My personal opinion is we will still have ruminant livestock in our farming systems. So we will still have sheep, cattle and dairy cows. Some parts of the landscape they may have been excluded from, but we will still be a producer of high quality, fine protein. We will see more horticulture, potentially more arable crops, and probably more return to native vegetation as well as farmed forestry. Remembering we can double horticulture, double forestry, double arable crops, and still have close to 8 million hectares of pastoral agriculture. And our landscapes are varied. We've got rolling hills through to steep hills. We will never grow crops on those hills apart from native vegetation and trees. Those will be the places where we do still see livestock being incredibly important to our domestic food supply and to our export returns.
What about water? Is that going to be a problem in the future?
Well, water. So in a changing climate, we do know that parts of New Zealand, particularly in the south and the west coast, will have more rainfall and it will potentially arrive in fewer big events. So we will have to ask really hard questions about our infrastructure and about our farming practices in those environments. But we won't wake up one day to those changes. We will need to adapt and there will be some significant adaptation needed. So we will see some retirement of landscapes. Then if we come to the east coast where we already see drought, we know we're likely to have more droughts and some of them may be more severe. So we will need to adapt to that. Now we can look 2 hours north to see how they're already adapting, and we can look across to Australia to understand their kind of adaptations. We've got some excellent irrigation schemes already in New Zealand. Should we store more water to manage the impacts of drought? We have real opportunity to do that because we do have the Southern Alps. We do have those big alpine rivers that move a lot of melted snow. The infrastructure investments are very substantial. So do we plan for that in the future? Yes, we should do, because it will be tied up with recreational activities. It'll be tied up with power generation and the potential to irrigate as well. So that's going to take a long-term commitment and a way, and the capital to do that is going to be challenging because I don't think our farmers will be able to raise the capital alone. It's going to have to be storing water and implementing irrigation schemes is very costly. The report prepared by MPI 2 or 3 years ago indicated that irrigation expansion would likely be around high-value crops. So that would pinpoint it to areas where those high-value crops could be grown. So I think we're going to have to keep investigating what we want as a country, how we're going to invest in it, and how we're going to get the greatest return for the whole country.
So at the moment, a lot of our income comes from farmers who are farming livestock, and there is a lot of pressure on them at the moment. You know, when we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions and water quality, and, you know, there's a lot on their shoulders. Can you talk to me a bit more about how things might change for them?
So it's really interesting when we look on pressure on food production, isn't it? Every food that we consume has a cost associated with it. And I think it's very easy for us to get lost in the marketing messages that some things come at no cost. Everything is extracting nutrients from somewhere, right? So our ruminant farmers really, I think, do feel like they're under the spotlight and have a lot of pressure. That is going to continue. My challenge to us as New Zealanders is to look at the place of ruminants in our farming landscape, in our history. You know, New Zealand flourished post-war. on the back of the sheep. We've come through global financial crises where New Zealand hasn't felt the pain to the same extent because our dairy sector products have been in really high demand. Ruminants produce really high quality protein, and that comes with a significant biological footprint. And yet we have a landscape where part of it is really only suitable to retire into trees or to grow ruminants. Let's continue to drive to be the most efficient. Let's fund the science we need to support the next big steps in efficiency. Let's make sure every tool is available and our farmers can prove that they're driving their efficiency. Let's keep investing in mitigation of greenhouse gases. If we could get a vaccine for methane, we know that's a game changer. It's easy to put into a system and it will deliver. So let's keep investing in those mitigations and other mitigations that will assist. And let's support the future of our ruminant industry by accepting all of our economy has to change to meet future ambitions. To be a low carbon economy, we all have to contribute. So let's keep having that conversation about what the whole of New Zealand looks like. And I think that's where the Climate Change Commission has looked across the whole economy. We aren't only focused on ruminants, or even though our farmers often feel like they're the only ones having to contribute. Our livestock farmers do need to own our footprint and do need to have the plans and be able to tell the story, how they're continuing to grow their efficiency, how they're taking on the challenge to keep being one of the most efficient in the world, how they're watching the research, investment and mitigation with pride, knowing that New Zealand's at the forefront of that mitigation and knowing when it becomes available, they'll get on board with seeing if it's going to fit and add value to their system and be part of the wider New Zealand conversation about how we're all contributing to a lower carbon future. So all in New Zealand can benefit from that livestock-based food production, the benefits for us as consumers of food and for the export revenue. So I think we can have it all. We've all got to share the story and all be on board with the story and what's needed to deliver it.
Senior social scientist James Turner is a big fan of listening to farmers, something he started doing pretty early on when he joined AgResearch 12 years ago from a background in forestry and economics. James, hi. Can you tell me a wee bit about that change?
Sure. So when I moved to AgResearch, it was a big shift going from forestry, where I felt like I knew a lot about radiata pine, to coming into the farming sector, where I knew very little. And so it taught me the importance of being humble and listening. So an example was attending a sustainable land management group with a group of farmers, where I maybe understood about 20% of what was said. And in that process, I learned a lot around the things that shape how farmers make decisions as well. So they're grappling with things around succession, how do they keep the farm going, keep the farm in the family, also the influences of what's happening off farm, things around news around regulations or around market changes, also what's happening in their daily life, day to day. And finally as well, also that farmers will have a lot of things that they're wanting to work through on their farm, and they'll have their priority for this year. So it might be, say, around fixing up the fences. And as scientists, we need to realize that when we're coming into those farms, what we think is a priority, because it's our science, so it might be around, say, weed management or pest management, isn't necessarily what's on the priority list for those farmers at that time. So it's being first coming in and listening to what are the priorities for those farmers at that time, and then what's the science that we can use to support what they're trying to achieve at that time.
And there's, like you say, well, there's a lot of things shaping what farmers are thinking and why they think that. And a lot of that is because there is a constant onslaught of things happening, isn't there? So what's the main thing that you would like farmers to know about these coming changes and challenges?
Yeah, I think the main thing is that getting through those challenges is doable. because we can see examples of groups of farmers and individual farmers that are already making changes ahead of those pressures around regulation, around market changes. And so there's an opportunity as farmers to connect with those that are already making those changes and see what you can take from that farm and put it onto your own farm, and also be inspired by those changes, as well as seeing those farmers as potentially support as you go through your own process of change, recognising that they've been through that themselves.
So for those people, is there anything they're doing that's special that enables them to make changes?
I think one of the big things that those groups are doing is that they come together as a group and realise that while each farm is different and the specifics of their farm means that the solution is going to be the same, farm forestry isn't going to look the same. They can learn from each other and support each other with ideas. So there's a lot around that sort of, okay, how are you planting up trees on part of your farm? What trees work? Where can I go to get advice and support? So that's a big piece of it, is just building that network of support around a farm and a group of farmers, and also connecting with new ideas that perhaps are outside where you might normally look. So a couple of examples where I've met farmers who have made those changes. It's been sparked by a moment where they've gone to a farm field day that they wouldn't have normally gone to. So one example was around regenerative agriculture, and another was around that farm forestry piece. Didn't really think about trees on their farm, but in going to one of those days, it sort of sparked some ideas that got them thinking, okay, it is possible, I can make some changes.
So when we're looking at those kind of making changes, bits and pieces, how can science help that work?
Sure. I think the key thing for science is to get alongside those farmers, get alongside the rural professionals, farm advisors that are helping them, and understand what are the science questions that those farmers, those groups of farmers have, and making sure that we work with the farmers to translate our science to the specifics of that farm and that catchment and that community. So there's lots of environmental science that we can bring around water quality impacts, say E. coli, sediment. There's also farm system science that we can help bring along together to sort of see how it all fits together, particularly when you're making those changes where you're combining something like planting trees with your farm system, those sorts of things. So the key is that our science comes alongside and understands the specifics of the farm and the community to help support.
And so what are the kinds of things that you're working on at the moment that sort of might be applicable here?
A lot of my research as a social scientist is around how do we set up these sorts of groups, like catchment groups, and how do we facilitate bringing together the rural professionals, the farmers, the scientists to tackle those sort of problems. So it's about understanding what everybody's interests are, looking at what might be a future around the sort of land uses or land management, and then what are the steps to get there. Another thing that we've been involved in a couple of times as well is also where you've got a community that's across farming and across urban, and the great opportunities that come from bringing together people who are living in town with people who are on the farm, and how they can together identify things that they can do, not just on the farm, but also in their town to help with, say, water quality issues. So that was like a project that we had in the Mangatarere catchment, where that catchment group was made up of people that lived in the town, and they identified things that they can do around reducing the amount of phosphorus that comes from what soaps they use, those sorts of things. So it's a great way of sort of recognising that everybody's in a catchment has a role to play in improving the environment and improving the economy in a catchment.
And that sounds really great in terms of, I guess, us sharing the load with each other and also coming together to support each other. And I know a bit of your work is around, social science is about people, right? So obviously we're in a time when, and I spoke to Robyn about this earlier, that there's a lot of pressure on farmers. We're in a time of pretty much constant change, and there are some big challenges ahead of us. So is there a way that we can use that support to help us all get through what's coming?
Yeah, I think it's back again to that sort of thing of where farmers are in that situation where they're experiencing a lot of pressure around we've got to make changes, we've got regulations coming and so on. The opportunity to connect with another group of farmers, whether it be a catchment group, to get that support so that you're not feeling like you're trying to tackle those changes by yourself. It can be a great source of inspiration as well as that sort of support. We found that in a project that we had recently where there was a group of 10 farmers that came together that were looking at how they can improve the health of the soil as well as the profitability of their farm. That project, Rereki Tai, really for me highlighted how farmers can support each other. So those 10 farmers started to help each other out. One farmer had, with the weather, had about 2 or 3 flood events on his farm. And the rest of the farmers rallied around to provide food, provide support. And then that meant that farmer had the headspace to go, actually, there's a piece of my farm where if I let that go back into a wetland, I'm not going to be battling to try and get through these floods. And I can see the sort of opportunities on the other parts of my farm if I intensify on those. So it's getting that group of support, if you like, to come up with ideas and get through those tough times as well.
I suppose there's a lot of, farming is full of complexity. There are so many factors that impact so many things. And so I suppose that support really helps to unwind some of that complexity when you need to, if you can. So that seems like a really beneficial thing for farmers to be able to support each other, because it seems simple, just helping someone with food or something like that, or some advice, or, helping them to get the space to think. But little things can be the big things, can't they?
Yeah, those little things all add up. It also means that rather than thinking you've got this big change, you can sort of like see the steps through it. So those farmers in Rereki Tai as well sort of started to build practices on top of practices. So firstly, it was a little bit around, how do I manage my fertilizer? And then it was around, okay, what sort of pasture mixes can I put in? And then it was around, where could I plant trees? So rather than I've got to make all of these changes all at once, you're stepping through it and visiting other farmers and seeing sort of what they're doing on their farm to get that sort of inspiration for what could I do on my farm as well. Yeah. And having rural professionals, farm advisors in there to help as well, alongside the science that can sort of like back up some of the ideas.
One of the words that has kept coming up with a lot of the scientists that I've talked to is the R word, regulations. As a social scientist, what have you sort of found out about just making more rules? Can we rules our way out of problems?
I think the challenge you find with using rules is that the first response tends to be pushback. Nobody likes to be told what to do. And I think that also misses the amount of change that you can get when you put in place that sort of supporting catchment groups, supporting farmer groups, and providing that sort of advice, so that then the regulation is really there for the last 5 to 10% that aren't willing to change. But you need that sort of change. But first and foremost, it's the change that you can see happening, like those farm forestry groups, those groups of farmers that have come together and planted the stream banks, already making progress. And perhaps that's the other thing with regulation as well, is it sometimes ignores the progress that farmers are making and just immediately says, well, we need more, rather than recognising what's already been achieved.
So it sounds like a lot of this comes down to kind of getting alongside each other and talking more, communicating more, and kind of, banding together, I guess, as groups and communities and friends and a country ultimately, isn't it?
Yeah, maybe that's my social scientist bent, that we like the idea that a lot happens when people come together and support each other and share ideas. And that's all with that sort of vision to where do we want to get to, and how do we support each other to get there?
So I suppose we have two choices. We can be afraid of what's coming, or maybe be fired up and inspired by the changes that farmers have made in the past and open to the new ideas and opportunities that the future holds for us. Science doesn't stand still, neither does farming. And it's clear that if we have each other's backs, listening and working together and supporting farmers, catchments and communities to make the changes specific to them, we can all face what's next.
AgResearch works to enhance the value, productivity and profitability of New Zealand's pastoral agriculture to contribute to economic growth and beneficial environmental and social outcomes. To find out more about our work and how we can help you, visit us at agresearch.co.nz/podcast or click the link in our show notes.